Historically, Ukraine was part of different states and different empires. So if you think about what is now Western Ukraine, it is part of Austro-Hungarian Empire and was a part of Polish interwar Poland. So you would see that many people who were Jewish would speak German, would speak Polish, would write Polish. And in Central and Southern and Eastern Ukraine, which was a part of Russian Empire and a part of Pale of Settlement, which is have different language, mostly Russian, but Yiddish was spoken everywhere. That's a big missing language in Ukraine, and the difference was also sharpened by the very fact that Galicia became a part of general government as occupied in 41, and so many people just couldn't escape to be that. And from Central and Eastern Ukraine, many people escaped with part of evacuation. In Western Ukraine, there is much less of continuity and there is more of a rupture. Those Jewish inhabitants, like of Lviv, of Rivne, of Stanislavia, of now Ivano-Frankivsk, not speaking of towns like Brody and Zolochiv, and who survived really, horrors of occupation and Holocaust, they left. They left to Poland and then left to Israel or the United States. You see that the very beginning, when Red Army came to the city, it's 44, it's summer, end of July, 44. The first months in local press, you actually see quite a lot of materials about atrocities, Nazi atrocities in the city. And then as this frame or more official story of the war and occupation solidified in Soviet Union, and it actually did not have much space for specificities and not to speak about exceptionality of murder of Jews as a genocide. So this was like wrapped in the story of Soviet citizens, civilians. And you would not find memorials to Jews killed or Holocaust memorials, but you would, going through some towns and villages, you could find maybe in some cases, depending on the also community, inscriptions of names of people who were civilians who were killed. But if you think about private, that's memory, it's a whole different thing. So people do tell stories for many. It is a family story because many Jewish people survived in evacuation, were able to escape, come back, and this is the story of their relatives. The story kind of, would say that after 91 things changed. It was changing with the perestroika, like with the late 80s, when lots of topics were coming. And for example, the memorial to Lviv Ghetto opened early 90s. The discussion and the initiative came with the establishment of Sholom Aleichem Jewish Culture Society. It's a late Soviet story, which became a story of the early independent Ukraine. But also the story of the city was still largely Ukraine-focused, minus Soviet. Getting rid of things Soviet in the city, street names, Lenin Monument was gone pretty quickly. And this was, of course, a challenge how the history of the city, which has a huge presence of Jewish Lvivians and Polish Lvivians, and how to incorporate that into the narrative of the history of the place. So it took time, took time to learn about. And so it's about learning about stories of people. It's learning about what happened. It's learning how people lived. About organizations, about ideas, about artists, about the whole wealth of urban life in the city. And in some of the commemorative projects are part of that search. But it's there's still so much to discover and find the ways of making it visible. There are signs which are not made by us today, but are uncovered or preserved, uncovered, and made visible. These are inscriptions on the buildings. That's where you could read that there was a shop, and in Polish, in Yiddish, or there was an office, or advertisement. So the city, like layers, cracks, come through, and buildings do speak in a way, if you want to listen and ready to hear. Why do we need to remember? I think to be human. And I think that what makes us human is relations. Relations to place we inhabit, relations to people around, but also people who were around while we were not there. So I think it's a story of who we are, and the more stories we can bring from the past, I think that more sensitive and in a way better human beings we can be. And it is a matter of of honor and of honoring people who were before me, who lived life in the city where I'm now living my life. I think that empathy and that can make the city, Lviv as a city now more Jewish in the ways it sees its past, and in the way contemporary Lvivians relate to people who had to leave their homes and find refuge and new home in the city, because right now Lviv is a home for 150,000 displaced Ukrainian citizens. I think basically everybody. There are big projects, but there are like infinity of small things you can do. If you happen to live in an old house, it helps, to think who've been living here. Like, maybe doing a little internet research and figure out who lived there, and maybe, treating that place with respect. Like kind of, have a sensitivity that there were people before me and there are people, after me. And at some point, maybe also opening the door. If somebody knocks or rings and says that, my grandparents or my relatives lived here. And I think these are little things which anybody of, us contemporary inhabitants can do. It's, not speaking of all the civil society, which are usual, not speaking of museums, artists, municipality, historians, professional, these are actors who are, and agents who are important, and Jewish organizations, because there are many of them, and in Ukraine is quite a vibrant Jewish life still there. You never know. You know, a bomb can fall into the building of museum or cultural center. But I think that most of all, it's because it brings massive displacement. If you think that cities like Kharkiv, cities like Dnipro, and Kyiv and Odessa, you know, they are really so close to the front line, and people were fleeing, and I think that this displacement really brings and endangers the existence of Jewish heritage in its most vital form, people. It's a fairly long story of the way largely Second World War is referred to, and the way Soviet Union is quickly or too simplistically described as Russia, which it is not. And if you think about the Eastern Europe, and if you think about you know, how to see that as a part of Soviet Union, it actually was Belarus and Ukraine, which, you know, bore the biggest toll of civilians and occupation, and also share a big and significant share in the Red Army. In Belarus, it's slightly different story right now. In Ukraine, it's also a challenge how to tell the history of Soviet period, how to acknowledge it or find a way of acknowledging it and being critical of it. In this German, it's a generalization, but like Eastern Europe has been quite overshadowed by Russia as, and it's more complicated simply. There are more countries and there are more societies there, you know, and learning about that or seeing that, I think it really helps to revisit the way we are, you know, we are thinking about, you know, the last war, and also act about, you know, this war. I've seen that there are many, you know, events and publications and interviews, and I think that there is a change in more complex way, seeing not straight from Berlin up to Moscow, but there are a couple of places in between. It just, you sometimes think that it's really a very high price of learning, right? So, I mean, what we are going through, you know, in Ukraine, but also in Europe in general, and in the world, does make us rethink what we thought we knew.